absolutely no one is asking Emma Hayes to make her World Cup qualifying roster right now, so we're going to do it for her. My name is Claire Watkins. This is this week's edition of The Late Sub. It is Wednesday, July 9th, and we're going to put a capper on this summer of soccer for the U.S. Women's National Team by talking about the larger player pool, and if I had to choose right now who I would be taking to next year's World Cup qualifying. Let's dig in. All right, so don't worry. We will be doing a big Euros group stage roundup next week. Once the entire group stage is set, we're going to talk about the highs and lows of the European Championships next week. But I wanted to take a second, love to take a second on this show and just put a real cap on the first half of the U.S. Women's National Team's half of the calendar year in what could truly end up being a transformative year for the team. Emma Hayes has emphasized that this is the point where things are going to start to get a little bit serious. They have a long break until their next friendlies in October. That will be at about the year mark for World Cup qualifying next year in 2026. A lot of evaluation over the last 6 months. We're going to see rosters be put together that, take players from all the way back to the beginning of 2025, maybe even the end of 2024, plus these players that have really done well in the last two camps where Hayes kind of widened that player pool, took a look at players, young players who might be able to compete for the team right away. At this moment, there is no pressure at all to be putting a roster together or anything like that. So we're going to do it for them. We're going to make ourselves do it on Emma Hayes' behalf. We're going to do a way too early U.S. Women's National Team World Cup qualifying roster over a year out based on what we have seen over the last, let's say, 6 to 8 months. It's not a bad construct, basically, for taking this player pool and making hard decisions. This isn't really a prediction at all or like a final word on anybody, but the hard 23 player cap can really force someone like me to hone in on those gut feelings of how I think players are doing, because at some point you do have to call it out, right? You can name all these players that are doing really, really well, but at the end of the day, not every one of them can make a roster. So this is me basically forcing myself to metaphorically kill my darlings here. But anyone who gets a mention in this type of discussion is doing something right. So even if on my mock, you've got a player that's just off or maybe down the list, that's great. That's a player that's doing everything they possibly can to be in the conversation, and who knows what might happen by next November. I also just want to take a moment and just sort of appreciate what we did see from the team over the last 6 months. I've always been struck watching these games, and now this is not Vlatko Andonovski apologism. I think Hayes is doing a much better job with this group than Vlatko was 4 years ago. But you do go back and think about that lost year that Vlatko did not have with this team due to the pandemic, and just the expanse of experimentation without results on the line that Hayes has been able to utilize in the way she's been able to ID this young talent. Like I said, Hayes is doing, I think, a much better job than Andonovski did, but I also think that Andonovski was having to do some of this experimentation during World Cup qualifying. And so the fact that the team has had a chance to take a lot of these looks, and they're over a year away from a competitive tournament with that on the line, and they're being able to make those decisions now is really, really great. It's good for the team. I empathize actually with some of the teams playing in major championships, these major regional championships this summer, because it's just go, go, go. A team like Germany has been playing in a major tournament for the past 3 years. And then they get 1 year off, and then they have to go again. And so the U.S. is just such a beneficiary sometimes of the way that the schedule actually works out, and the way that they are positioned in the world, in the fact that they do not have something like the European Championships or the Copa America to sort of force their hand to get results, and they really can dig in to the evaluation. So with all of that said, I'm going to put my name on the line, and you can blow me up if I'm way off. I know I probably will be, because we got a long ways to go until this tournament roster is actually announced. But like I said, I'm forcing myself to do it. I'm saying who I think is in, who I think is out, and why. We're going to go by positional groups, and we're actually going to start from the front to the back, because we have to start with this forward line. I think Hayes has some very, very difficult decisions to make depending on who is available. I will also say I'm doing like a 7-6-7, 7 forwards, 6 midfielders, 7 defenders, 3 goalkeepers. You can argue me on the numbers, but for me, I'm like, we're not close enough to really get into that too much. But 7 forwards, mental experiment, and we're starting big and impossible with the US's insanely deep, talented attacking line. Now, this is where sort of the dream also might deviate from the current realities of the team that makes kind of this sort of thing difficult, right? Availability and injury recovery are not all in the same place for every player. I think, as we know, with the forward line that's very much focused around this triple espresso of Mallory Swanson, Sophia Wilson, and Trinity Rodman, we have no idea if they're making it back to the U.S. Women's National Team in the same form as 2024. Or also we know that the U.S. that they're coming back to is very different than it was in 2024. There's going to be some growing pains upon growing pains, working some players back into the fold. But again, for this mental experience, I'm not going to cut anybody from that trio sight unseen because that would be bizarre. So my 7, if everyone was available, and we'll talk about sort of, again, mediation if we have to, mitigating factors, but if everyone was available, I think the 7 forwards that have sort of that inside track right now are this triple espresso: Mallory Swanson, Sophia Wilson, and Trinity Rodman. And then I would say Katarina Macario, Alyssa Thompson, Lynn Biondolo, and Ali Sentner. I am both steadfast in these picks. I'm standing on them, but I'm also really curious how this group would actually end up playing together because, like I said, we haven't seen Triple Espresso perform with sort of this new midfield, with Katarina Macario building her minutes back up, really coming back into the mix. Macario is a very different player from the center forward position than Wilson would be. How does that work? Do they complement each other? Do they get on the pitch at the same time? Is this just a strength upon strength where you have the ability to start different center forwards in different games, depending on what is presented for you? I think it would hopefully be very complimentary as much as it's a challenge, but that's something to get excited about, I think, in 2026 to see how some of these pieces put together. Alyssa Thompson's a no-brainer, right? She's proven herself to be kind of the fourth espresso, if anything. She's the fourth wheel of that triple attack. She's been incredible in 2025, can relieve legs on the left side. Just another impossible U.S. winger to defend. I've also just been very frankly impressed with her workload for the United States over these last 2 international windows. She's been asked to play a lot, and that is something that she struggled with when she was a little bit younger. I just think that she's going to be a player on this team for a long time. Lynn Biondolo and Ali Sentner, these are my last 2 on. It's kind of obvious, right? But I think they make it for their versatility and the ability for them to come off the bench and be that boost that the United States needs. They both can play multiple positions. Biondolo can play wide and she can play central. Sentner can drop into the midfield. We've actually even seen her kind of start in the midfield before. So I think Hayes is thinking that this is a player that can play on 2 different lines. And they've done just enough to get a slight edge over some of those other Swiss Army knife players for me, if we're talking full strength, combining sort of the 2024 Paris team with what we've seen in 2025. Now, if any of Triple Espresso, for whatever reason, can't make it, and like I said above, completely possible, this does open the door for some other players who have been doing everything that's been asked of them. It's talking about Michelle Cooper, Emma Sears, and Yasmin Ryan. Now, this is where I get into this as a positive, right? Like, none of these players have done anything other than what's asked of them. And like I said, the fact that they are in this conversation, I think at this point in the development process is a huge positive. But they all have slight pieces to their games that leave them less three-dimensional. They have also an experience gap, as we know, with a player like Biondolo. That's always going to be something that Lynn Biondolo has in her back pocket that other players don't have. You maybe just want to have that experienced player on that front line. But you see Cooper, Michelle Cooper, I've sung her praises over the last couple of weeks. I think she's a wonderful addition to the team, but she is a non-shooting winger. Do you need someone who can kind of do both? Sears sometimes can be put in the back pocket of a defender when her speed isn't as much of a factor. That's more just about seeing her against harder competition, I think, where she's playing against outside backs that don't have a problem with her pace. Ryan honestly just simply hasn't had enough time sometimes to make those serious connections. She's come in off the bench and done a really nice job in the past. We've seen her come in even in situations where the U.S. was struggling and maybe the final half hour, 45 minutes, and done really well. But I just wonder if she is seen as one of those players as a potential starter, like we've seen with Biondolo and with a player like Sentner. I mean, the bottom line is that the U.S. once again has just a wealth of attacking talent. And I think the nice thing about this versus, 2023 or even 2024 is that it feels like that depth is versatile and we're seeing it on the wings and in the central attack. And that's where a piece like Macario is incredibly important and can just show new sides of this team, even if Sophia Wilson is limited or unavailable, or just the fact that those two together could do something very, very cool. I like where the attack is at. Difficult decisions to be made, but that's my 7. But like I said, those other 3 waiting in the wings if anything happens. So moving on to midfielders. This was one of Hayes' biggest overall projects, as we know, coming into the job, right? The midfield was pretty broken when Hayes took the job in 2024. And she kind of had to wait to make some of those big changes. They had to get through Paris. Obviously, that goes very well. But if you go back to old episodes of this show, as you know, one of the main criticisms of the team throughout that success was the inability of the midfield to sort of impose themselves on games. So the midfield has changed. It's a different role. It's less attacking than it used to be in some ways, but hopefully more technical and better in possession. It feels like Hayes would like the midfield to be an attacking generator and a connector and a pace setter. And the way that you string passes together, you get the passing triangles together, you get on the defense, you get your counter press together, just a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more versatile without the sort of separation that we always saw under Andonovski, where it felt like, okay, this midfielder is playing defense, this midfielder is playing in the attack. And you saw that gap open in the middle of the pitch for the United States. So with that tactical shift kind of understood, I think the larger philosophical question for this group is more just about leadership versus on-field impact. And that is talking about some of these major players for the U.S. for a number of years. That's Lindsay Heaps. That's Rose Lavelle. What role do they have? Is this a situation where Hayes needs to dig in and say, we're just bringing the youngsters? Is it a situation where Hayes needs to kind of bring a mix? I'm going to go down the middle here, and I am going to say, they need that mix of experience and young, really kind of blistering, exciting talent. And I also just frankly have to say that Lavelle showed up to, this camp in June and July and crushed it. And I saw Heaps do some really interesting things against a sort of park the bus back five in the window before that. There are things these players can bring to this midfield. However, I am not advocating for Lindsay Heaps and Rose Lavelle to start and play 75 to 90 minutes every single game. That is not what I'm saying. And I think that sometimes it feels like with these players, it's all or nothing because that's how we've seen them utilized by their managers. But I think these players should come to a tournament like this, World Cup qualifying. But I think they become a little bit more of your situational midfielders rather than your all the time midfielders. Because like I said, Heaps, she is someone who is actually very good at unlocking a back five or unlocking a team that has parked the bus or is sitting back off the ball. I don't like her in the midfield against competition that plays deeper in transition or has their own sort of formidable midfield trio or quartet. Don't like her in that role. I don't think she should be starting for the US all the time, but she is the captain of the team. And so I am also I think she has things she can bring to this team from a leadership role. I think Rose Lavelle is very similar in that we saw she was awesome in the last international window, but as we know, her physicality is not always a guarantee, and we also just don't know, she's not always reliable during long tournament stretches. She tends to get injured a little bit. However, my midfield mix would be Sam Coffey, Lily Johannes, Lindsay Heaps, Rose Lavelle, Claire Hutton, and Croy Bethune. Now we could go in the other direction, right? The argument for this, rip the Band-Aid, bring the teens, old guard be damned, construction to the midfield, but let's slow our rolls a little bit. We'll see if it comes to that in a year. But for where we are right now, Lavelle, for example, as we saw, was a very good attacking generator in this last camp. She also, as we saw, was a very good deliverer of a dead ball, which is something that the U.S. has really struggled with in the last year or so, extended past maybe last 2-3 years. Coffey, I really, really like sort of as this in-between. She's a wonderful leader. She has worn the armband. She's getting better at defensive midfielder every single day. My quibbles with her have more to do with pace, but I actually think mostly on the defensive side of the ball, but she's really growing into the role where you don't always have to be the speediest player if your positioning is right. And I think her positioning has really improved. I also think that, again, with a more balanced midfield around her, you're not asking her, again, just to go right back to that Julie Ertz archetype of you've got this player covering immense ground, trying to keep up in foot races with the other team's speediest players. I don't think that's being asked of Coffey, and I think as her role becomes more nuanced, she's actually growing into it. There are pace questions with that group, but I also think that they're learning to mitigate that. But the future of the position is young, as we know, and you got to bring the kids along too. Johannes and Hutton are the two players that have really stuck out to me, I think to many, right? They play a position that the U.S. has deeply needed to cultivate after failures, that number 8, that connective role, that line breaker that can also help on the defensive end, that can maintain possession, again, create those passing triangles, never leave their players on an island, avoid that gap that we used to see in the midfield for the US. Those are those players. I think Hutton and Johannes have shown that, but they're young and they cannot be asked to, and by young, I mean like really young. These are teenagers, and I don't think they should be asked to be thrown into the deep end just yet. Now, Bethune, a little bit more of an injury question. As we know, she's coming back from injury, but I don't think there's a reason to believe at this juncture that her 2024 was a fluke. She is coming back, and I do think you need a non-Lavelle number 10 who can combine again with the idea that Triple Espresso might be back. You maybe need that more traditional attacking playmaker to run with a player like Sophia Wilson or Mallory Swanson or Trinity Rodman, or to connect with someone like Alyssa Thompson. You do need that player on your team with different things asked of you, with different personnel around you. So I like Bethune for this. And maybe you could switch her in. There are other really young players who I think have as much good of a shout, though obviously they play slightly different roles in the midfield. You could go more defensive and want to bring someone like Hal Hirschfeld in. You could keep cultivating Olivia Moultrie as sort of, again, that number 8 that can play as a number 10. She really can generate attack on her best day. There's the continued Jaden Shaw project, which I obviously would like to see come along. We've seen Corbin Albert get a lot of minutes in a variety of different roles. She does have some versatility to her that I think Hayes likes. All of those players have the ability to grow, and I think you could bring them in or out. But again, sort of in a miraculous way, these decisions are getting easier for Hayes. Lavelle looks good. Heaps looks good. Johannes looks amazing. Hutton gets better every single game. And like I said, I think Bethune fits the profile, and I think you have to give her space to get back to that 2024 form, because I think there's a reason why she went to Paris, and I think that she can continue that journey once she gets her feet back underneath her. Keep moving back. Defenders. I actually think the defender position is somewhat surprisingly one of the most wide open areas for the US right now, and that became incredibly clear over the last 2 windows. These players have an opportunity to represent the US in a competitive tournament, and I'm going to put some players on my list that played their first US games just like a week ago. And I'm like, I think that's it. I think we found it. That is the position of the outside back and sometimes the center backs for the United States, where you're just like, it has to happen quick sometimes. We're going to keep cultivating it. But I do think that some of these young players have shown that they can be that, and they will continue to grow into more difficult competition. We have seen OBs get exposed and be like, oh, maybe they actually aren't at the international level that we need them to be at. But I like what I saw in these last 2 windows, and I like that position became a focal point, which leads us to some of these, again, bigger philosophical questions about the defense. I think the 2 that stick out to me is there anyone from this young group that's less experienced outperforming the concept of what would be a 34-year-old Crystal Dunn, who, as we know, does not always play outside back for club and, would like to have other roles on the team? Is there someone, and I mean this actually like in a positive way, is there someone who benches Dunn or turns that at least into a higher rotation where Dunn doesn't have to play every single game? Or I think the other question is, who truly is Naomi Girma's best center back partner? I don't think we saw those questions answered in the last couple of camps, despite the opportunity maybe for some sink or swim moments. So my list, it's a little bit, I mean, you could say that on the outside, it's kind of wild. There's a lot of new names here, but also I think this is relatively safe. So my list for defenders, 7 defenders. And as we know, you can bring 8 if you want to. This is just mine for 7, but Naomi Girma, obviously, Emily Fox, Emily Sonnet. I think if she is healthy, Tierna Davidson. If Davidson is not available, I think Tara McKeown actually has the inside track here. Crystal Dunn. I do think that we're going to have some players maybe bench her, but she absolutely should still be on this team. Avery Patterson and Lily Reel. There are defenders that we've seen even less of that I think is in this larger bubble, but we could absolutely see part of a November group. Giselle Thompson is a name that I know the U.S. is actually very excited to get on the pitch. She's just had some lingering, tiny little injuries that have kind of stunted her opportunity over the last 2 camps. I think Emma Hayes would love to get Giselle Thompson involved more. I think they really like how she can play in the attack. They want it. That's another young player that I think they see as a huge part of the future for this team, but it's just not there quite yet. Hopefully she'll be able to get in a couple more camps, get a little bit more experience. I think Carrie Abello is another example we just didn't get to see a lot. both really bright, but I just don't think you can add them over what we have seen from Real and Patterson, and even going back to Dunn at this moment. I also think the center back race between Girma is slimmer than you might think. It's crazy to me always with the United States women's national team, how you're like, oh, their defense is so strong. We feel so solid about it. Generational defender after generational defender. But who is the partner? Who is that partner for Naomi Girma? Like I said, I do still think it's Davidson. I think Hayes really liked that partnership when they were able to have it in Paris. But Davidson is fragile. And if she can't make her way back and have that same form, I do think that we're going to see Mickey Yohn perhaps become that third CB. Emily Sonnet might be the starter, actually, next to Girma. She's been given a lot of responsibility in recent camps. She's a wonderful veteran, immense international experience. She's very good in defensive transition, as we know from sort of that, like, in case of emergency placement of her as a defensive midfielder. So I kind of like her sort of with that in-between mode with Coffee, who I said sometimes needs help in defensive transition. I think we might see Sonnet's minutes go up, not down, which is really, really interesting. The late hero of the U.S. women's national team. But I haven't seen a player like Emily Sams really get a foothold in terms of minutes, despite, a lovely club campaign. I do think there are either, further options that haven't been in camps. I think people talk about, Ava Gaetino. It's a player that we could see. I don't know what that mix is exactly, but if we're just looking at who Hayes has been calling in for the last 6 months, I think our starter pool is kind of the same as 2024. It looks like it's Naomi Girma. It's going to be Emily Sonnet in whatever role best suits her, Tierna Davidson if she's available. And then I do think Mickey Yohn has been getting some more starts. I think they like what she brings to the team. So an interesting group for defenders. I think, like I mentioned, it's kind of crazy, but I really do think that Avery Patterson and Lily Real have the ability to walk onto this team in a serious, serious way. And then finally, the goalkeepers. We won't spend too much time on this, because honestly, I think we're heading closer to a consensus on this position than maybe we feared when Alyssa Nair retired at the end of 2024. In 2025 so far, we've seen 4 appearances for Mandy McGlynn. We've seen 3 for Fallon Joyce, 2 for Claudia Dickey, and 2 in 2025 for Jane Campbell. We've also seen Angelina Anderson be in camps, but she has not yet made an appearance. I do think that's a bit of a sign. I think Anderson is going to probably fluctuate between the U23s and the senior team, and they're trying to figure out exactly where she fits. So this is one where if World Cup qualifying started tomorrow, I do think we just have our 3. I think we have our 3 players. I think we have Fallon Joyce, Mandy McGlynn, and Claudia Dickey. Jane Campbell got a couple of real quality starts at the beginning of 2025. She played some very good teams, but it seems like she, while fit, has not been selected in the last couple of camps. I feel like there is maybe a message being sent there beyond just that she's a known property. Also, her club form hasn't been as good this year as it was last year. Campbell just to me seems like the odd player out. And then I think Anderson is more of a prospect for the future. I've talked before about how I actually think that there are some limitations to this group right now. As we know, Fallon Joyce has some trouble with the ball at her feet. I think Mandy McGlynn and Claudia Dickey are very similar players, which is that they're incredibly talented, but sometimes need to get over that experience gap to be composed under pressure. There's nothing like playing the number 1 for the U.S. women's national team. I think it's hard to do. But I do think we're starting to see this group form. And it's always amazing to me because this happens every single time. Like every single time you're like, who's it going to be? And then someone emerges and you go, no, you know what? This person looks like the number 1 goalkeeper for the U.S. women's national team. And I think right now that is Joyce. And then there's McGlynn and Dickey behind her. So that's my group. I'm planting my flag in the sand. I'm putting my name on the line. We will see how Hayes approaches this mix in October. So much can change between now and the actual World Cup qualifying tournament. But this is starting to feel like the bigger group. Like, I was actually surprised going back and looking at the old rosters from the beginning of the year and just being like, yeah, there's actually not a lot of variety here. There's not a lot of changes. This is the group. And I think everyone who has been in the mix here should feel very, very good about what they're putting on the table. And then it's just back to club form and to see what twists and turns await in the fall. The Late Sub is part of the Just Women's Sports Network. This show is written by Claire Watkins and produced and edited by Parker Fenton. To get more of your favorite women's sports content, subscribe to the Just Women's Sports newsletter and follow Just Women's Sports across all your favorite channels.